last few decades, the city has widely been described as the genesis of all things creative, game-changing, world-changing. Cities are where good ideas thrive. Cities are where revolutions turn tides. Cities are the future of you and I. But it's not that simple. What is innovation on African terms?
I think even having the statement is problematic.
An empathy-driven view of innovation is not part of our business culture.
There's not just like, okay, everybody, let's have a party.
I don't think it's restricted to technology or, new equipment.
Progressive thinking meets societal interest in change, meets political will.
It's hard, and it's becoming harder.
Is it impactful?
It can be a very lonely system.
Innovation can't thrive in a context where people can't participate.
Really tired by innovation for the sake of innovation.
It can really mean whatever you want it to mean.
Are we rolling?
Do you need a stretch or anything? Are you fine?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Was my voice fine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you guys clap for me? Sorry, one person clap really loud.
Do that thing?
Yeah.
Take one.
Makes me curious about, what is real innovation? What is that to you?
Wow.
Urbanization.
Oh, I have so much temptation to answer from my academic perspective. It makes me ill. What is innovation for us?
I think even having the statement is problematic.
Okay, tell me why.
I'm really tired by innovation for the sake of innovation. The number of things that people do that have no real value and context, it's a really bandied about term, and people just want innovation. It's like this craze, and we obviously fit into that because we've done something that hasn't been done elsewhere in the world, but the only reason we ever did that is because we were listening to people.
I think it's a whole bunch of things in one. So there's not much that's new under the sun, but I think what makes things new are the different hands, the different minds that touch it. The idea of a building is not a new one, but the person, the individual context, and how that's interpreted makes it can become innovative. So I don't know. I there's just certain words I just try avoid because I just feel like it's gonna be like dogs chasing our tails, and innovation is one of them.
I think it's a word that's thrown around quite a lot. Yeah. So we were making a joke amongst ourselves about the word innovation and the fourth industrial revolution. It's used to a point where I don't think anyone really knows what it means anymore. Yes. And it means whatever you need it to mean.
So what do you need it to mean?
I think innovation is anything that helps society in a unique way, but I can't define it any other way. Because it's easy to have interesting ideas for the sake of them being interesting, for them to have impact in human lives.
Don't get me started on fourth industrial revolution because that's just one of those terms that just gets thrown around a lot. Yeah.
I mean, I want to get you started on it.
Industrial revolution means is that productivity will shoot up.
A technological revolution that is blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological sphere.
The word is thrown around, so in our case, ours is medical technology, and doesn't fit into the fourth industrial revolution. It's kind of more basic healthcare, it's about accessibility, and that's seen as more boring or mediocre compared to fourth industrial revolution, which doesn't really mean anything, but it sounds interesting. So fitting into AI systems, automating everything, etc. It is important, very cool, but I think there's hype around it that then takes away from other meaningful projects. So it's important to have hype and focus on something like fourth industrial revolution, but I think it shouldn't take away from projects that also help people in other ways, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So in the space that you find yourself, what problem are you solving? In the space that you find yourself, what are you making better, right? So, for example, with my publishing, when I was still publishing under Jacana Media, I published everything, I published to everyone. But it was when I published the stuff that I knew intimately, the stories that were familiar to me, that I started to see the change. I could measure my impact. And that for me is important. You know, you can do a book that's important or that's necessary, but is it impactful? You know, if you couldn't impact, a country, a generation, a moment, time, is your work as important? Is it something that people can go back to 50 years from now?
There's a lot of ideas that are kind of first world, and that entrepreneurs are kind of trying to bring first world solutions to a place like South Africa or the African continent. And the downside is that they're not addressing those foundational issues that you mentioned, like energy crisis, food shortage, water shortage, job creation. Well, to some degree, they are addressing job creation. And I think what I've seen pretty early on is that if people are not empowered or enabled to participate in the economy, and then there isn't really much room to innovate, or innovation can't thrive in a context where people can't participate. So it's kind of like a catch-22. If you can't enable the people, if you can't mobilize them, if you can't empower them, they can't actually engage in your super innovative high-tech solution, because they can't even get from A to B. They can't even afford the next meal. So, and I've seen this come through a lot actually. There's been a lot of interesting innovation around solving really fundamental problems. So around healthcare, around waste, around energy, around job creation, around skills development. And I'm liking the trend in those businesses or apps.
I think we're not having an honest conversation about the context that we're operating in as South African entrepreneurs. There's so much information that relates to different types of markets that don't necessarily mirror ours. So for example, like in my case, when I'm talking about digital literacy, we're expecting people who still have pit toilets and no electricity to be given tablets. And when they are given those tablets, the teachers themselves don't know how to operate those tablets. The kids themselves aren't taught to take the tablets apart and put them back together. So we're always taught to be consumers all the time. We're not taught to be pioneers in the way that we're making things. And that impacts on a variety of different things, because we have the raw products and then we have them manufactured elsewhere and then sold back to us.
Now, the National Development Plan 2030 acknowledges that the global economy is evolving and requires greater attention to enhancing industrial skills development.
Innovation is one of those words that I actually try very hard not to use in conversations or anything that I write, because I don't know if it holds any meaning anymore. So what would I like innovation to mean? I would like for it to mean just being able to see things anew and afresh. It's not necessarily about creating something new or remaking something, but being able to see it afresh. I think for me that's what innovation means, or I would like for it to mean.
And I think sometimes we use the word innovation to describe everything that's new or slightly different. But for us, innovation is really when progressive thinking meets societal interest in change, meets political will.
We're looking at like Terry now. He's overseas and is having conversations with Anna Winter. He's a finalist for LVMH. You see Nelson Makama, who's on the cover of Time magazine. I think the possibility of what you can achieve as a creative now in South Africa has just grown immensely. So it's It's interesting and it's very exciting, and I think it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much to LVMH and the incredibly inspiring jury behind me for this major honor. Thank you.
It's hard, and it's becoming harder. And in some instances, it's about moving faster. We used to see mobile phones come out every 2 years, like a new mobile phone comes out every year. There's more technology, there's more digital demand, there's bigger paradigm shifts from analog to digital, and that's driving a lot of people to execute, right, or charge and force innovation. And I think what's happening at this pace is not always a long-term thought. It's like, the innovation is being churned in a way to churn product, right, to turn over product and make sales for companies. But innovation also, I think, needs to be a responsible approach. And I think at the fast-paced world that we're living in right now, we're sometimes having a little bit of not a long sight over it. It's also burning and churning people. To innovate, having ideas, it's a special talent. I think it's a gifted talent, especially for creatives. And I think that innovation is underpaid and it's undervalued because it is a human gift resource as opposed to a natural resource. And I think that creatives need to applaud themselves that they have the stamina and the vision to create and paint a beautiful and more inspiring future of tomorrow with innovation. But I think they are under rewarded for their efforts, and I'd love to see that change. I think that without creativity, we won't be able to see the future. If we can't create it in our minds, we can't hold it in our hands.
By the year 2050, it is estimated that over 60% of Africa's population will be living in cities. Cities that historically were built not for the flow of life and liberty, but for the extraction of resources and the depletion of dreams. Still, they say, the fourth industrial revolution is upon us. Everybody, innovate.
Take two.
What's your experience been of the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Cape Town?
I mean, that's a very loaded question. So, like I mentioned before, Cape Town is software hub. So in terms of soft tech, this is the place to be. So hardware, not so much. So there's that. There's also the fact that I think the entrepreneurship space here is really young. Like, we're getting a lot of startups in the industry, different industries. I mean, obviously I'm speaking coming from a medical diagnostic or biotech space. There's a lot of new inventions coming about and a lot of young individuals who are pushing those technologies. There is also, some spaces have been difficult to navigate, others not so much. So I'm not sure what kind of examples I can give you. So there's things like, walking into a meeting and people just assume because you're a woman, you're just there to take notes or some stuff like that. That's happened quite a lot.
The ecosystem currently has matured sufficiently. I think we have, since 2 years ago, we have real venture capital in the space. So I think for about the last 10 years, we had no real venture capital. So anyone that had 1,000 Rand or 10,000 Rand could call themselves a venture capitalist. And there was just not enough money for early stage seed funding. So the problem was normally you got money when you didn't need it anymore. So none of the banks, none of the institutional investors, none of the private equity players would invest in our kind of startups, which are non-traditional ones. But if you want to do a Burger King franchise, you'd get money immediately.
My personal view, there isn't VC in South Africa. I think it's a different way of spinning private equity. the VC guys over here are very conservative. You have to jump through quite a few hoops, and by the time you've doctored your business model to get it to an investment point, a lot of your original ideas aren't there.
If I should sort of go back to the history of how the entrepreneurship ecosystem developed in other countries, so even in Silicon Valley, in Israel, in Germany, wherever, government is a major catalyst because they are the ones that can fund sort of pre-commercial types of ventures. And in South Africa, I think that's where we've had a problem. So government really didn't understand entrepreneurship at all. And then we've had lobby groups like Simudisa or Silicon Cape or others developing from entrepreneurs themselves that then put pressure on government. They've been very successful. I think over the last 3 years, some of the top issues that startups were struggling with and facing with have been addressed by government. And I think the biggest catalyst now was the Section 12 venture capital company model that SARS has now made venture capital investments tax deductible. So you can set up a Section 12J company, and we have 60 of them currently, and you can very quickly raise 10 million rand. That's the minimum fund size. So 5 private individuals each put in 2 million rand. That's the most common model we've seen now, and they have 10 million rand to spend on startups, and for them it's tax deductible. So there's a major incentive now of private individuals, private wealthy people getting involved in startups, and I think that has been a big catalyst because sort of VCs were too small, insignificant. We didn't have the scale. We don't have a large e-commerce market. We don't have the traditional things VCs looking for, which is very quick scale, and our startups didn't conform to the traditional VC funding model. And then we have now private individuals, angel investors, like a lot of them, very good money. It's patient capital, doesn't expect immediate returns. It's the perfect type of funding. And you have corporate venture capital. That is, I think, the other big catalyst, that many corporates in industries that are being disrupted have seen startups as a way to get new ideas, new thinking into their company.
Challenge? Yeah, the young people face in urban cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town.
I think one of the biggest challenges is informed by the nature of cities like Cape Town and Joburg. It's like every other city in the world. It's a contested space, contested insofar as land is concerned, opportunities are concerned as well. There's lots of those, but it's a very competitive space.
I think it's important to have people who are very passionate about something to go ahead and create the space for those things to exist. I do believe that there has to be checks and balances to make sure that people are actually delivering on the promises, but I do believe it's really important for people to hold themselves, and the ecosystem also must hold them accountable. So if somebody's saying that they are putting out X amount of whatevers, we need to be able to see those numbers. We need to be able to see those stats. As the ecosystem, I think we're owed that as well.
Social media really fucked us over. It should fucked us up, and because it's put a weird culture to entrepreneurship, because the order of how things happen is in 2 ways. The way I understand it is that people are quick to report what their next venture is, what their projects are about and whatnot, and so much energy and time is spent on reporting and not actually doing.
I think a lot of the time where people are looking is not necessarily right, and how we quantify entrepreneurship is also a bit of a problem, because the lens in which we're looking at how we define entrepreneurship is also quite sexist, and it's difficult to find people who tick boxes where those boxes were designed for straight white men. So there are women that exist that are entrepreneurial, that have entrepreneurial businesses, but they are not necessarily, they're not catered for. Just like a lot of things in this country, a lot of things in this world, inclusion or diversity becomes a buzzword, but when it's time to actually incubate these women, you find that their spaces don't really cater for their needs.
So I use an architectural analogy. I think it stems from this design of the household being one that's quite domesticated and cool. It sounds very conventional, but that's within that framework of designing the house for the woman to kind of maintain and to be in and foster the family whilst the man typically goes out and works and acquires money for the household to function. Kind of embodies a structure that we still face today. And South Africa is a very interesting case because the way in which gender is played out at the moment is constantly fluctuating, particularly within the space of women of color, where the professional space versus the creative space, let's put those to aside, even though there are some overlays like architecture, but the professional space having been dominated by these very established groups. And if you look at the groups that have founded your Boschendals, your Naspers, these boys clubs, to say it's like it is, call a spade, these boys clubs have established a network that still keeps them very tight and also allows them to progress at a rate that leaves women behind. At the same time, or to add to this, women are not completely experts in that process and in that structure of creating such networks for themselves. You do find some really successful examples like a Stokvel, which starts with women of color who are wanting to save up money typically in a neighborhood, small group of people. My mom is in one, I've been in one myself, and now they've become quite sophisticated with investments, etc. And so that's an example of how women start to creatively incept themselves into a structure that was designed maybe not so intentionally for men by men. And it becomes difficult to identify exactly why not many women are in the industry by way of having started their own initiatives and organizations. I think along this line, as a woman, one requires collaborating with men, and it can often come off as tokenism, and that in itself is a symptom to the disease that you described, which is the fact that there's this huge skew in gender in the entrepreneurial space. And I suppose I'm painting out a context, maybe not so much answering a question, because I am still trying to uncover that as well.
We haven't had the luxury of taking risks in our history. A lot of our history has been centered around survival, around the next meal, around trying to get at least one person out of the poverty cycle. We haven't really had the luxury of just trying things and actually experiencing failure. So I think that's a mindset more than it's a structural problem, but it's also a mindset issue where we're not positioned to do things where we know we're going to fail.
I spend a lot of time in Limpopo, and I've got a lot of friends that are entrepreneurs, and there's a lot of things that the guys in Limpopo are doing, and proper businesses in Venda that these guys are running, and they don't use any of the terms that we use here, obviously in the big sort of startup ecosystem. And I think if we had to transfer that knowledge, then a lot of people would feel sort of disconnected from the sector. They would feel like, okay, there's this sort of Joburg entrepreneurship, and then there's the rest of us. And I find that that's a big way of sort of disconnecting people or not marginalizing people, but there's people that feel like they're outside of the sector just because they don't necessarily understand or speak the language of entrepreneurship and startup and innovation and all those things. It should be a lot African when you think about some of the language that we use. We should become more local, more African, more sort of grounded within the way that we speak.
I think ideas have never been the problem. I've never found ideas to be the problem. I've found a few things. How do you connect them to, firstly writing a good brief, understanding what the challenge is. A lot of the times it's we're asking the wrong questions. Secondly, connecting a good idea to a space or a place where somebody could actually make it happen. I think young people are very frustrated around having one good idea, which is, and I'm going to use a very bad example, the taxi rank, let's say, outside Cape Town station on the Strand Street side, or just outside the waterfront, where people wait in very long lines, and someone saying, well, I'd just like there to be a bench, I'm even happy to sponsor it or design it. And what happens between that idea and it not happening?
What's been missing for me especially is the practicality part of it, because people say they are creating core working spaces, but there's a whole 80% of people who can participate in that model. So how do you actually make those places that you say you're creating practical enough so that those people can access them?
Innovation is doing all the time. It's to just extend on this, it's this German proverb that a professor once gave me. I know it's German, but it's keine Tag ohne Linie, which means not a day without a line drawn. And so in order to be innovative, in order to remain creative and be an expert in your field, you have to draw every day. You have to exercise your creative muscle, or else you will lose it. And that's innovation, I think.
If I were to have a pen and be able to write the structure, I would almost encourage entrepreneurship at a young age and have institutions almost like campuses where you go in with an idea, so that your entry criteria is an idea or a problem you're trying to solve, and over a 3-year or 4-year period you graduate with a fully functioning business as opposed to a degree. I think that would be a really interesting experiment to try out. But I guess in terms of what's happening already, I don't think there are too many gaps. I think there's enough support out there. It's maybe around educating entrepreneurs about what is out there and helping entrepreneurs navigate that sort of plethora of options that are available to them.
I think a good incubator is one that understands your industry. Like first and foremost, they need to understand your industry, they need to understand your market, who your consumers are, who the best funders that you can approach would be, what sort of risk mitigation strategies you can have. That entire pipeline, if they understand your industry, I think that's a good incubator first and foremost. And then secondly, one that actually does offer hands-on support. And not in the sense that, so in our experience, we've gone through a few of them, and that's why we're sort of hesitant to go into another. Unfortunately, a lot of funding opportunities come with you have to be part of an accelerator or part of an incubator. But a lot of them they'll have tons of tasks or activities that you need to perform, and it's all the same thing. And once you've gone through one, you can go through 3 others using basically the same material. And everybody will tell you no other accelerators like ours, but fundamentally they all work on the same principles. They're all trying to get you market ready, and there's certain things certain boxes that you have to tick to get there.
So for me, and I think one of the things that people overlook is the amount of time you have to spend within any specific industry to know it and understand it well, to know how to disrupt it, where to disrupt it, So I think I've taken enough time now in this publishing industry. I came in as an intern 9 years ago, and I think I've taken enough time to understand what the problems are. And I think the reluctance of the publishing industry, because books are very elitist by nature, like literature is very elitist by nature, and I think book people want to kind of presume themselves to be high up and like highbrow. But then what that does, I think, in the end is it leaves them in a little cocoon where they're not interacting with anyone else. So there is no so what I try to do is I try to get out and interact with people in other industries to see how to collaborate.
To me, I I don't think money is the most important thing. I don't think money will be the problem solver. I think it's a matter of like the right strategy to get to the next level.
I'm a woman alone in this face value, but I have a lot of people who are backing me up from the different industries who are going like, I'll be there if you need a show or like, you know, a performance or recipes written or stuff. There's a lot more sharing happening, I think, because from the get-go, I've shared everything that I have in that space. So, hey, my family give me a lot of advice as well, and like, hey, you're crazy, I can take this. But we all crazy. Like, Food Jams was built from friends. We were all experimenting. We were all figuring out things, and the more energy they were bringing, the more energy I realized that this could hold.
I think where we are in humanity as the world, the creative industries are the spaces that allow for job creation, because a lot of what happens in creative industries is actually, it's manual, or at least it's brain work, so it's the least jobs that are likely to be replaced by machinery or automation. But I also think the creative industries are an important space for expression, and as an African, to be part of a movement where businesses are actually supporting the new expression of what it means to be African in Africa and outside of Africa, that excites me.
We are always thinking about future-proofing. I suppose we call it either progressive thinking, which is another way of saying foresight, which is not that you need to plan everything and can plan everything for the future today, but that you actually build in a culture and a way of doing things which demonstrates that over time.
I'm excited to see how entrepreneurs are recognized, embraced, supported, and also listened to. You know, it's going to be an interesting journey the next 20 years, because we are in a new Generation X, different space, and I think there's a lot more shifts that happen on a ground level than we actually always see and can admit.
What youth needs and what the young people needs is young leadership. Somebody that, you know, is committed to their wants, their needs and desires. Somebody that understands that ego, right, it can't exist in the future. I think politics are failing youth, I have to be honest with that. I think it's hard to navigate in the economic and the political landscape, and you know, it would be great to see more youth actually taking the stick and transforming South Africa together.
I make you uncomfortable to show you that it is possible for young people to stand up and step up in their society to lead. I am 23. I'm Black. I'm a woman, and I'm an African. And who would have ever imagined that I'd be in Frankfurt today talking about youth empowerment? See, youth empowerment is not a choice for us. And I say it's not a choice for us because every section of the world is falling apart. We see genocide, gender-based violence, slavery, poverty, refugee camps, attacks by extremists, and despicable leadership. And that's just naming a few. And when I think of all these things happening in the world, I always remember the words of Professor Pakeng from the University of Cape Town. She once told me, "We are the ones we have been waiting for."
We are connected, we are born in a new age, we are all friends, we have no differences separating us, and I would love to see that we all just come together, because we have to build tomorrow, because we're going to live in it.
And I think we're off to a good start, because being in Joburg, you have people from all over the world to learn from and to collaborate with. So you get to get the best from everywhere. And that's where the opportunity, I think, lies in a space like Joburg and other spaces that will diversify so far as representation is concerned. But you know, it's quite obvious that right now that we're in the beginning stages and there's obvious struggles. But if there's any place that I feel like will be a great representation of the continent in future years. It's Johannesburg. Everybody's here to do magic.
Sound too sort of generalizing on this, but I think we need to be bolder and solve these big, hairy problems that we see in our lives. And I think if you look at the challenges that we're facing, we are the best people to solve those problems, because these are the challenges that we faced every single day of our lives.
Wow. Wow, freedom. Wow, that one's difficult. I literally went blank. Can you really define freedom? I don't know.
Freedom, essential.
Success.
What a curveball.
Money.
Difficult to balance.
Africa.
Opportunity.
Exciting.
Water.
Life.
Youth.
Life.